Hi.
Hello.
Hello, we're live. Very first ever LinkedIn Live.
Very exciting.
It is. So, welcome. Welcome everyone to our first joint LinkedIn Live session. It, it's great to have you with us for our timeless tips for virtual meetings. How everything and nothing has changed about how we keep people engaged in remote meetings over the last 2 decades. Please do feel free to comment as we go along and ask questions. I've always found participant questions really improve these sessions. They add so much, and I look forward to hearing from you. So let's introduce each other. I'm here with Nancy Settle Murphy. She's a founder and president of Guided Insights, a consulting, training, and facilitation services company based outside of Boston in the USA, with a special focus on helping distributed organizations collaborate and communicate even more effectively across time and distance without friction. And she is author, and I'm just going to bring that up, author of this book, Leading Effective Virtual Teams. You're a frequent presenter, Nancy, and an author of hundreds of articles. So thank you so much for joining me.
It is such a pleasure, Penny, and I would have the privilege of now introducing my longtime friend and colleague, Penny Pullen, who leads Making Projects Work, Ltd, based in the UK. She focuses on organizations grappling with the challenges of creative collaboration and challenging times, especially those leading projects and programs of change, whether in person, hybrid, or fully remote. Penny is the author of many books, including Virtual Leadership, Making Workshops Work, and Managing Successful Programs. I also want to add that Penny and I have known each other over 22 years and have only met once in person. And that was, I
Once.
believe, in 2016. So we're friends and we've been friends ever since.
Super. Thank you so much, Nancy. It's great to see people joining. Hello to Jackie Harper, who says she's excited about this session, wanting to, she wants ideas to improve virtual meetings. And great to see you as well, Adeniyi. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Do please comment as we go through. Super.
So, Penny, I'd like to start. Do you remember 22 years ago, what led you to first contact me? What was happening in the world that prompted you to reach out?
Oh, Nancy. Oh, it was such a relief to find you, I must say. I was meant to be flying to New York to host a kickoff for my first ever program. My ticket was dated. We had paper tickets in those days, as you remember. The date on the ticket was the 13th of September 2001. Many of you will have heard the story, but of course, it wasn't to be. 9/11 happened, that tragedy, and so of course we were grounded for months. So I had to kick off this program somehow using 2001 tools, doing it virtually. So I scrambled around to find who was an expert who knew this stuff, and one name kept popping up the whole time. And Nancy, it was yours. And I got in touch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was great hearing from you and to be considered an expert at the time. And
Yeah.
and for me, I'm sorry, Penny, were you
Yeah,
going to
yeah, I was
ask?
just going to say that I think you're also a facilitator, and I just trained as a facilitator, so I used that lens, that perspective of facilitation in the whole way I approach working with virtual colleagues, and it seemed to work really well. And with you, I could validate that I was on the right track, and you gave me wonderful tips. And we worked together to create a checklist, I think, all those years ago. So Nancy, how did you end up in virtual work? Because that was before me when you started.
It was before you. I was a mom of toddler twins at the time, and I wanted a way to work from home so that I could practice what I preach. And I dove into, I think it was a book, I think it was by Jessica Lipnack many years ago. And that was the first I ever really heard of virtual teams and virtual meetings. So I started studying the concept before 9/11, but 9/11 changed everything because my biggest client at the time, for whom I had run 2-day on-site workshops all around the world, said, our employees are grounded, no more traveling in planes. You have to figure out how to translate this 2-day workshop into a series of virtual meetings. And I said, absolutely can't be done. And they said, well, we'll find someone who can figure it out. So I said, okay, wait a second. Let me try. So that's when I started and why I started.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So
And
you were going. Go
I was
ahead,
just going
Nancy.
to say, back in those days, did many people in your company, because I know you worked for a large company at the time, use virtual meetings, or was that the exception?
I think people always saw it as a second best compared to being in person face to face. But because, and it was Mars Incorporated, we had people all over the world, but especially sort of Europe to the US, those meetings, those time slots between sort of 2 p.m. UK, which I think is 9 o'clock and 9 a.m. Eastern. That afternoon slot on those video suites in the corner, it was really hard to book them because that was the time when our office hours overlapped. It was almost impossible to get in then. But people saw being together in person as infinitely preferable. What about you for your clients? Were they using virtual meetings quite often?
Well, yeah, they were, because I had been focusing on global distributed teams since before 9/11, really. But the meetings looked really different. There was no cameras, or almost never was there a camera unless you were really special. And some of my big clients had these very fancy, expensive, what they called telepresence studios that
Oh,
you
yes.
had to book, and you had to fight people to book, but that was about it. Otherwise, it was a speaker on a conference room table with a bunch of people around it.
Those speakers that sat in the middle of the table that made it really hard for anyone remote to hear anything. I remember those.
And they still sit on those tables in many places.
Yeah.
So for you, thinking about your company and perhaps clients you've worked with since then, back 20 years ago, what was the state of virtual meetings from your perspective?
It was mostly conference calls, unless you ended up lucky and you could book that corner video suite. I can remember I was doing one program which was working with people all over West Africa as well, because it was a chocolate company, that aspect. And many of them were in very remote locations. So they were on mobile phones, and the audio wasn't that great. And there was no way we could do shared screens because all we had was audio. I was part of a global team. Most of our meetings were virtual, but we did travel together so that we could be together every few months. But yeah. What would you add, Nancy?
Well, I want to amplify something you said earlier, Penny, and that is virtual meetings were considered not real. They're virtual. They were always second best. Lots of technology limitations, poor internet access in many areas. Most people did not work from home those days. They might have worked from a satellite office, and even then the internet speed was slow. Sharing slides was considered super leading edge. People who had the app and had the know-how were really the cool kids on the block. It was very unusual. And then the whole idea of the phone conferencing, unless you work for a company that would give you the dial-up access and passwords, it was very expensive to arrange conference calls. And by the way, virtual meetings wasn't even a term. They were called conference calls.
Absolutely.
So Penny, we talked about what was different from 20 plus years ago when it came to virtual meetings. What in your mind hasn't changed very much now, fast forward 20 years ahead?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing is that, as we found out at the very beginning, it's all about facilitating people, making it easy for them to do great work together and to participate and collaborate. And that should be the focus. And if that is the focus, things will work better. What I found as well is that often people focus on the technology. 20 years ago they did that and they still do it. But technology, virtual technology, is just like electricity in a house. Most of the time, you don't even think about having electricity in your house. But without electricity there, a house can't really operate very well in the 21st century. So for me, the virtual technology is brilliant, but let's not focus on it. Let's just focus on the facilitation of people, and we'll be good then. So,
Very true.
yeah. So Nancy, what about you? What are some of the same challenges that people faced then that we still face today?
Well, keeping people engaged is a really big one, and away from distractions
Yeah.
like multitasking. It's somewhat easier today when people use cameras, but even so, many people have mastered the art of staring into a camera and thinking they're surreptitiously typing when we know they're focusing on something else. Uh, yes. Um, and facilitators, I find, especially when we're not in the same room, still, despite cameras, despite the Zooms and the Teams, find it hard to rein in dysfunctional behavior,
Mm,
like people
mm,
dominating, like people not
mm,
talking. So I think that's kind of a perennial challenge. And then still, when I work with clients who show me their agendas to accomplish these objectives in this amount of time, I just think, no way. You're being completely unrealistic about doing
mm.
that.
Yeah.
And I think of two other things really quickly. One is the wrong participants. Either there are too many, for example, to make a
Yeah.
decision. You might have 20 people on. It's not never going
What?
to happen. Yes, and then the wrong participants, often the people who are making the decisions
Mm.
are often not there, and then not enough interaction, and which sends people right to multitasking.
Or sleeping.
So yeah, were you
Yeah.
sleeping on me? Um, so yeah, so those are some of the
Mm.
challenges that I don't see having changed in the last 20 years.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I'm just going to jump in here and say when people have their cameras off, it means that all those skills that you and I developed when we were doing conference calls just come straight back and are really, really useful. Who would have thought it?
And Penny, so what do you think are some of the biggest changes that have made the biggest difference?
Well, I think just, so many people are used to virtual meetings since pandemic lockdowns. So you'd hope people would know how to design them and lead them more effectively. But what about you, Nancy? What are your thoughts? What do you think's made the biggest difference?
Oh, I think you mentioned technology before and
Mm,
that we ought not to let technology lead how we design and facilitate. At the
mm,
same time, I think the technology that's made the biggest difference is the availability of asynchronous communications where we can ask people outside of the real-time meeting to
mm,
participate, to start conversations, give ideas, sometimes vote, weigh in on certain things. I
mm.
think that's allowed us to make the time spent in real-time workshops much more effective. And I
Absolutely.
think another is that we have many more devices where we can
Mm,
participate from and apps that allow from that for that. So
yeah.
if I were on a beach, which I really wouldn't want to be in a conference call for work, but I could if I really wanted to,
Yeah.
or in
Yeah.
a car or from my home office here.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I joined a session yesterday from my car in between two in-person meetings, which is brilliant being able to do that. Couldn't have done that in 2001.
I
But
really hope you weren't driving at the time.
I was parked in a service station for the
All
whole
right.
time.
Okay. Just want to make sure because that happens a lot. And I just say, no, hang up. It's not
Oh,
that important. No.
Nancy, I'm sure you'd know I'd never do anything that crazy or illegal, by the way, in case anybody is unsure about that. Are there any more things that you've got that are the changes that have made a more difference, biggest difference?
I I just think, and you mentioned this before, that there's so much more prevalent today. Not just since COVID. I mean, of course, since
Hmm.
COVID, we've all learned how to, or many at least, knowledge workers who were sent home.
Of course.
have learned how to meet virtually, are used to it. Doesn't mean people do it well, but
Absolutely not.
now that people are having hybrid meetings, that they are much more prevalent than ever before from
Mm,
many more locations. So I think that's something that's very different.
mm. And I think the other thing is that really high speed internet is much more available than it was in 2001 too. Yeah,
Yeah, in most locations, that's absolutely true.
yeah. In most, yeah, and around the world as well. Yeah. I mean, I can remember early in 2020, just before the lockdowns hit, somebody came to my office for an in person meeting, and they were absolutely stunned that I had just come off a meeting with someone in the US and someone else in Papua New Guinea. They were completely and utterly stunned that anyone could do that. I don't think that would surprise anybody now at all. It's just becoming much more normal that you can meet virtually just as easily as in person. In fact, probably more.
It's actually become a necessity in today's world of hybrid work. So, Penny, thinking about today in 2023, what tips would you give today that might be much the same as you would have 20 plus years ago, or maybe a little different? What are some of the tips that you feel are timeless?
Okay, so I'll give you three because I could give you the whole book, but that would that would take forever. So agree up front. How are we going to work together? That's something that I always say for any meeting, any workshop, any session that you're running. So how are we going to handle people who perhaps go quiet? How are we going to handle drawing in information from everybody? How are we going to be? That's really helpful. So one of the things that you can do as part of that is to agree that you'll poll the group. And again, this is something that I developed years ago in the days of conference calls when no one could see each other. Agree that you'll go around the group in random order, just asking for a very little feedback from each person. And that could be 1 word, 2, 3, something like that. So on conference calls, when we put that in place, it meant that everybody kept listening just in case their name was the first one to come up. And when we didn't have that in place, if you ask somebody a question, you stated their name, and they came back, can you just repeat the question? You'd know full well that they hadn't been listening. And so when you're in cameras off situations, even today, that works really well. Just letting people know that we'll be polling the group, we'll be going around and asking people for input, and it'll be in a random order. And as ever with any facilitation, have your plan A and your plan B and your plan C, because things may well go differently from what you expect, whether that's technology, whether that's how things work in the session, or whatever. Absolutely. I can see some questions coming in for a little bit later on. So, Nancy, what tips would you add that still apply today?
Well, one is build in multitasking, but on task. We know that people are hardwired to be texting or have otherwise itchy fingers doing their email, etc. So think about when you're planning your meeting, how do I encourage people to, whether it's answering a poll question, putting something in chat, raising their hands in front of the video or through a Teams or Zoom. So think about that and allow people to multitask. It also keeps them away from multitasking on other things, and it keeps them more engaged. I like to build in opportunities for interaction at least 3 to 5 minutes. And it could be a small interaction like a raise of hands or verbally going around the room like you were just talking about, Penny, the virtual table, I should say. A big piece, and it's always been true, is come with great questions that are stimulating, that are thoughtful, that cause people to think, and give people a few seconds of reflection, especially for your introverts. Allow people time to think.
Absolutely.
Anticipate issues, like you said, come with a plan A, plan B, plan Z. And that is especially true if you are likely to have people who you know are known for their dysfunctional behaviors like dominating or arguing or criticizing. So think about how you're going to handle that. And finally, I'd say if the purpose of the meeting is to reach agreement or build consensus, allow more time than you think. Allow time for conversation. If you push to consensus, once you leave that virtual room, everything can fall apart if you don't have true consensus, and that requires conversations.
Absolutely. And you can't put a time box and say at the end of this we will have complete consensus. You just have to give it the time it needs. We do actually have some questions that have come in, so thank you very much. Jackie says, any tips of gamification of virtual meetings? Nancy, what do you reckon?
Gamification, I'd want to know more whether that means like use of a second life type thing, or using games like an improv game, which I'm a big fan of, using improv exercise either to energize the group, to when they're making introductions, breaking the ice. So there are loads of really quick improv games that people can use, and I can provide, or we can provide links later on to some of those resources. But I love using them. I love the use of improv. Penny, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, gaming. I mean, sometimes you don't want to go too far, but you can tap into a little bit the sort of a natural competitiveness. Sometimes it's appropriate, and you can have breakout rooms and encourage them to create something, maybe a poster or something like that in a virtual on a virtual whiteboard or virtual collaboration space, just to give it a little feel of a game, that they're up against time, that they're competing with different teams. But don't overdo the competition, because that's not so good.
And I would just add to that, Penny, make sure you allow enough time. If you're going to have a game, it should serve the purpose of the meeting.
Yes.
And there needs to be enough time to get everything else done you need to. I've seen people start games of whatever kind, and suddenly the meeting time is over and you haven't accomplished anything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So all of it should serve the purpose. What are we here for? That should be agreed right at the beginning, any session. And gamification is great. Get people, it helps keep people engaged if they're having fun, but as long as it's serving the purpose, as you say. We've got another question coming in. What is the correct meeting etiquette concerning the use of camera by participants? And Nancy, I'd say with that, you probably want to agree up front what's appropriate for that particular meeting. What would you say about cameras and meetings?
Oh, I have so much to say about cameras and meetings. First of all, I think we need to give people grace when they don't have their camera on, because there are some legit reasons. Other than it's a bad hair day, I don't consider that a legitimate reason.
Me neither.
But there are many studies on brain science that say how fatiguing it can be to be staring into the camera and paying attention. Having said that, I think it's really important to have norms for a meeting. So it might be for a team meeting, let's say, when we join, say hello, please make sure your cameras are on. When you have something to say, please turn your cameras on. And above all, when you're in breakouts, have your cameras on.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
So I think the key is to have norms that people agree to, and to know that occasionally there will be times where people need to make an exception. So don't force people to have cameras on, but establish it as a norm. Penny, what do you say about that?
Absolutely. I mean, we're of one mind on that. Thank you, Nancy. One final question. Tips for engagement for very large meetings of several hundred or thousand participants. And perhaps before we look at that, what's the biggest virtual meeting you've been in ever, Nancy?
Well, I've been a participant probably in a meeting with several hundred.
I was in one with, I think, over 5,000 quite early on in the lockdowns. I was attending something run by the MIT group who are investigating Theory U, but It was amazing. I think they had to get special permission from Zoom to be able to do that. But it was huge. So what are our tips when you have really big meetings like that? What would you say, Nancy?
Well, I think one variable to consider is how many people, if any, are in one central location versus people in other locations. Because if it's a hybrid meeting of any size, you really need the expertise, the technology, getting the audio right is super important. Making
Absolutely.
sure that you have enough cameras and that they're well positioned. And I think what you mentioned, Penny, about getting permission from Zoom or Teams or whatever the product is, whatever the app is, super important to understand what are the limitations and to get the necessary permission. And then if it's depends how long the meeting is, but no matter how many people, if it's a long or longish meeting, you want opportunities for people to weigh in, even if it's through chat, if it's in small groups. It is tempting when it's that many people just to have a one-way meeting, and that's ultimately very unsatisfying to everyone who's there.
Oh boy, there'll be people just going, ugh, going to sleep. Absolutely. So interaction. I mean, I love having a sort of flow, a river of comments coming in on chat when there are hundreds of people, because it gives you a real feeling for what's happening in the way that if you were leading a session with hundreds of people in a room, you could never get that immediate feedback from everybody. So I love that chat flow coming back, and breakout rooms are so important. Give people a chance to actually interact, discuss some of the things, and then come back and feedback potentially. So we have another question from Bindu. Thank you, Bindu. She says, "Hi, Penny and Nancy, great conversation." And her question is all around how is virtual collaboration seen after, the initial part of the pandemic when we had to go virtual. She says, although we're still dependent on virtual meetings, there's a lot of emphasis on in-person meetings. She's getting mixed messages, and she'd like to know what our views on this are.
Wow.
Are you finding mixed, in-person, virtual? Are you still finding quite a mix of these?
Oh, yes. I'd say most of my clients lately have been coming to me for help with hybrid meetings versus all in person. I still have requests for facilitation skills training for all in person meetings. That's relatively rare these days. More of the challenges relate to virtual and hybrid. Many of my clients are giving and getting mixed messages about the importance of coming in the office. But even those who mandate, and there are a lot of mandate, coming in certain days, most of my clients, when they have their standard for the team meetings, weekly team meetings, is all virtual. Even if there are one or two who are virtual, that's enough for them to say, we're going to create a level playing field minimally for our team meetings. So, yeah, so despite the mandates, most meetings I think that are taking place are hybrid.
Yeah, I'm getting a lot of pushback in terms of hybrid meetings because of the audio quality and the video quality. It varies from client to client. In fact, I've been doing quite a bit of I've been surveying and talking to people about the challenges that they're having with virtual and with hybrid meetings, and I'm noticing that their satisfaction with their hybrid meetings is quite a bit lower than with their all remote. As you said, when everyone's remote, there's a level playing field. When they're hybrid, some are in the room, some are virtual, then there are many more challenges, and the overall satisfaction drops off quite a lot, I find. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I just want to add to what you just said, Penny, is when you do have some people physically in a room and some people virtual, if you are going to have breakout groups or small group discussions, I usually like to have the virtual folks, even if it's 2 or 3 breakouts, and then the in-person, and then have a way to have them come together and debrief together. I think it's very difficult and usually not necessary to try to have breakout groups with some virtual and some in person. You can do it, and I have lots of tips for that, But
Yeah.
I'd say try to avoid that in general.
Absolutely. I mean, you and I are singing from the same hymn sheet here, Nancy. Use, if you've got people in person and you've got people who are remote, let the people who are in person actually have the benefit of being in the room together, and let the people who are remote all be at the same level of access, all in the, when you're all virtual, you all have the same front row seat. So absolutely, I'm completely behind you on that one. We do have another question that's come in from Jenna Mitchell, who says, talking of hybrid meetings, any tips for making it easier for those in the room to be more mindful than when they overtalk each other? Others on virtual can't distinguish the content. I've tried letting people know they need to be mindful and slowing the chat, asking to take turns, but often it feels like the virtual are left behind. Absolutely, Jenna. Absolutely.
I highly recommend someone in the room to be the advocate for the remote folks. And that means, and that might not be the facilitator. In fact, it usually isn't. It's someone else in the room who's paying attention to the talking over, to the muffled voices, to the sound of the candy wrappers crunching in front of the mics, and making sure that the people who are working remotely have a chance to weigh in. And that means looking for their expressions, looking for their hands up, looking for the chats, and also deliberately saying, okay, now let's hear from someone virtually. So that advocate in the room makes a world of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I call them a buddy, the in-room buddy for the remote participants. It's good to have some channel of communication so that they can send those messages through to the in-person advocate or buddy. There's one other thing that's really, really helpful in that situation. And at this moment, I've gone completely blank, but there is something really, really helpful. And of course, it's just disappeared. Oh, yes, I've got it. I like to think of hashtag remote first. So if you are in a hybrid session, as a facilitator, as a participant, I always talk about moving the spotlight, the imaginary spotlight that the facilitator has on them in sessions. And I've always in the past have talked about move it onto the participants. And now I say move that off onto the remote participants. So you always ask remote people first. And you always, whenever you're going to do an activity, you address the remote people first. When you ask questions, you ask the remote people first. That's just one of the ways of leveling the playing field just a little bit. But there are lots of other ways, Jenna. And there are, perhaps I can, underneath this, I can add links through to some of the presentations I've done on this that might be helpful. I think there are about 15 ways.
I want to add another idea here. If you have people grouped in, let's say, regions, you have people in the Asia Pacific region, people in the Western region, etc. As either the advocate or the facilitator, the one in the room, you can be mindful of that and say, okay, we haven't heard from anyone on the East Coast yet. We haven't heard from the group in the UK yet. So it's important to be mindful of the different groups. So you don't necessarily have to call on a person, but you could say someone from the product marketing function. Could someone weigh in?
Yeah, absolutely. And in that case, just a piece of paper and a pen so you can note down when people are taking part from different areas can be really helpful. And of course, there are different types of hybrid. We have the hybrid where we have a few individuals who are joining a sort of central in-person meeting. They're dialing in using technology, but you can also have several in-person meetings all scattered around the globe that are connected together via technology. So different types of hybrid. Yeah. Jenna says thanks. So thank you. Nancy.
Yeah, I think one point I wanted to make before that's different about virtual meetings, and a tip in a way, is think about what people need to do, read, review, weigh in on, etc., before the actual meeting. So what pre-work is realistic, what's necessary, what's mandatory, what's optional, because worst thing you can do is when you start a virtual meeting is start reviewing content because half the people didn't scan the slide deck or the article or whatever you
Yeah.
asked them to
Yeah.
do. And as a consequence, people who have done the pre-work are sitting there frustrated and upset with you that you're letting
Mm.
it slide for other people. So be realistic about what's needed from everyone to prepare so that you can start the virtual meeting with a conversation instead of a lecture.
Absolutely. Conversation instead of a lecture. I think that's a great place for us to round up. We're actually 35 minutes in, Nancy, for our first LinkedIn Live. So that's great. Oh, we have something from Helen Holder. Great tip about advocates. And Helen asks, how can we be mindful of non-verbal cues and body language of those joining? Are the signs different, and do you think more thinking on this is needed? I suppose the first thing is if they've got their cameras off, we have no non-verbal cues, body language. Well, we might have voice tone if people say things. Yeah, do we think the signs are different when you're in a virtual meeting?
Well, I think it's certainly harder to see body language because we're only seeing shoulders and heads. And
Mm.
because so many people, we physically can't make eye contact with people. We can stare into the camera and then I can't see the person's face. So that's one thing. There's no eye
Mm.
contact. The other is if I'm scrupulously staring at the camera, I might look really interested and seem interested, but it's more that that's an expectation that people have, and I don't want anyone to think I'm distracted. So I'll
Mm.
stare, but that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm interested. So I think signs really are more about the level of verbal participation or chat participation
Mm.
that we
Mm.
see. You can certainly see if someone's bored, and most of us can figure out if someone's multitasking. This is all assuming the cameras are on.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
You know,
so
you
I
start
think
hearing clicking in the background.
yeah, exactly. But I think the signs of ennui or disengagement are similar. They are just harder to see because we don't have the whole body image. We can't necessarily see the slumping if someone is frustrated or bored. Yeah, like that. Um, so yeah, I think the signs aren't that different, but it's harder to see them if we as the facilitator are trying to be mindful of staring into the camera. I can't That's why having a co-pilot, and Penny, we haven't mentioned this really, having a
Another great tip.
co-pilot, so
Mm.
important
Mm.
for, especially for a meeting or a virtual training session. So if Penny's my co-pilot, she can be scanning the images, she can be looking at chat, she can be looking at the raised hands, she can be looking at the look of puzzlement on everyone's faces, and say, hey Nancy, maybe you want to paraphrase that question because it really wasn't clear, or she can send me a private text or private chat and say, maybe time to move on, it looks like people are bored. If I'm the one facilitating, I'm not likely to see all that.
Super. I think we've come to the end of the questions, and so I think what I'm going to say is please do connect on LinkedIn. Let us know if you like some more of these. And of course, there are always, if you like more immediately, there are books, of course. I'll just bring up, there's Nancy's Leading Effective Virtual Teams. And then there is also My Virtual Leadership, which covers hybrid as well. And then there is one that I haven't brought up yet, which is this one, Making Workshops Work, which includes tips for hybrid and virtual as well. So thank you so much for being part of this, and let us know, please comment if you like any more in the future.
Thanks everyone, this has been great. Thanks for the questions especially. And
It's
thanks
brilliant
Penny for
having questions and input from people, and knowing that there are people out there cheering you on is brilliant. Jackie is saying any links. I will add the links afterwards. Thank you, Jackie. Good idea. I'll put in links, and I might even put in some discount codes. If you think that might be helpful, if anyone wants to get a copy of the book, that might be helpful. Super.
Thanks everyone.
Au revoir. We may be back again.